page. This is another edition of No Labels Talks. I'm here with Ryan Clancy.
Hey, Holly.
Our producer Marianne is actually lurking around.
Well, she is lurking, which she usually does. You know, it's interesting. This is the Friday before Thanksgiving. So I was talking to Marianne and she's like, well, we need a podcast for next week. And I was like, look, it's Thanksgiving. Can't we
Can we have a break?
Can we just take a week off? And she looks at me and says, listen to me. We need a goddamn podcast. Get on there and do what you're told, or there's going to be hell to pay. So, here we are doing a podcast under threat of I don't know what, but this is how Marianne operates.
One word for you, Ryan: union. You know what I'm saying?
We need to unionize this because Marianne is just like, I don't know, she's like Rockefeller. She just busting us and yep.
Yeah, exactly. So, Ryan, I tease you at the beginning of our weekly podcast with different titles, but you really and truly are kind of the head and heart of No Labels and the politics of problem solving. And I know, I think people would be interested to know, how does a nice Irish Catholic kid like you who's working in a Democratic administration come to be a leader of the revolution?
Well, look, of course, it's been a long time, like 13 years. And, being in a party and being part of No Labels were, of course, for most of our history, like not oppositional things.
Mm-hmm.
It was just kind of, you could be a Democrat but think to do things, you actually have to work with other people that you don't agree with. Of course, when we did our Unity presidential project, that started to change a little bit. All of a sudden, it was kind of hard to be that. And of course, you knew that well, Holly. I'm not, you got some pretty not so veiled threats over the course of our effort to walk away from No Labels. And we detailed that in our Department of Justice complaint.
Yes, absolutely. Well, how did you come to form your initial kind of political, worldview? Who along the way was influential for you in shaping that?
Well, the funny thing is, I remember being totally apolitical in college.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember the Bush-Gore election was, 2000. I was, I guess, a junior. I distinctly remember really not caring who won.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, just because I just wasn't paying attention.
Right.
And then, of course, like a lot of people my age, 9/11 was a very formative moment for me. It was, I remember exactly where and when I was. Just like,
were you living in New York at the time?
No, I was living in my place in outside of Villanova, where I went to school. And it was September of my senior year. So that, kind of woke you up to, well, gee, there's a world out there. And so that's how I started to get involved. And I think I initially joined the Democratic Party, not so much like I was affirmatively thinking that, I'm endorsing everything the party's for. It was more like in opposition to Bush and Cheney. And it's like, well, okay, I'm not that. So I'm probably where I am. And, I found my way down to DC in 2006 to go to work for the DSCC, which is the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee. I was working in digital fundraising. So I was like writing those annoying emails you get.
Oh, you're to blame.
Yeah. The funny thing is, at the time, my department was actually called the Department of New Media. Because at the time, like emails and social media, like that was new. Wow, what is this?
Yeah.
So that's how I got my start. It's interesting though. I think the thing that made me think this kind of politics was a fit for me, ironically, was when I was in the first Obama administration.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a speechwriter, and I was at the Commerce Department. So I was having to make a lot of cases at that, like kind of the business economic case for the Affordable Care Act. And I could explain to you chapter and verse like the logic behind that bill.
Mhm.
And it passed, and look, I do think it did some good things. It definitely expanded access to care for people who didn't have it. But one of the things I never understood at the time, and I do now, is because that bill passed with only Democratic votes,
Mhm.
from the second the ink dried on the bill, you had Republicans in Congress trying to undermine it. You had Republican governors in the states who didn't want to implement it, like they wouldn't do the Medicaid expansion, for example, and all kinds of ways to chip away at it. And some people could argue, look, that doesn't matter. It's still good that was on the books rather than not. And you can have a good argument about that. But what it told me was, when you do pass things where you don't get buy-in from the other side,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean you can never do it or should never do it, but it means like it is at least worth the effort trying to get some buy-in, because if you don't, it actually diminishes the impact of what you're trying to achieve.
I've thought about this before. In many ways, we are, there are many dichotomies about what it is we're trying to do. But one of them is we in some ways are traditionalists, because the original construction of our government forces compromise, and we're trying to preserve, protect, and advance that. And the parties over the years have been very savvy about how they can eliminate that, to
Yeah.
be able to do, one party legislative acts like the healthcare bill.
Well, so I thought about this. If everybody remembers our history, and when they're bringing the country together, the big debate was, how do you divide the power between the big and the small states? And that was going to break apart the whole constitutional convention. And of course, the thing they came up with was the Connecticut Compromise, which is, all right, we're all going to get, every state's going to get 2 Senate seats, and then we'll have a House by population. And one of the guys from Connecticut, Roger Sherman, was the one who led that. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know what made me think of this a couple of years ago, but like, if that happened today, then that act that Sherman did, which he's sort of this heroic figure in our history, he immediately would have been on Twitter, and that would have been called the Sherman sellout.
Mhm.
Everybody would have beat the crap out of him, and like that would have been the end of that.
Mhm.
And that's the thing I think that people forget, is like, we always read about our founders and all these heroes throughout history, and it's like, we always talk about how they stood up for their principles, and we don't ever think so much about how, like, they played the long game, and they accepted these incomplete and imperfect compromises. Like, we actually put this, I think, in one of our booklets. 1955 is when Rosa Parks said, "I'm not getting up from my bus seat."
Mhm.
It took another decade to get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and those were both bipartisan bills. So when
Mhm.
they passed, they passed with Republicans and Democrats signing it. When that happens, it's like it kind of sends a signal, I think, to the country that says, all right, listen, we kind of settled this issue for now, and now we're going to go on to other things. When you just jam things through with just one party, it's never settled. Right? It's every party's just waiting till they can get back in and just undo everything that just got signed into law.
And also, I mean, and I think about this, the whole country was founded by people who didn't agree with each other on anything except for the principle of liberty. I believe groupthink is inherently un-American.
I know.
And so it's one of the reasons why I was so disappointed in the direction that the Democratic Party took, because why is it that diversity is celebrated on all aspects except for thinking and ideas,
Well, it's funny. I was talking about somebody this morning. I mean, when I was growing up, to the extent that we're like these puritanical people who are trying to police what you think and do, you actually associated that with like people on the right, like Jerry Falwell and the moral majority people. It's like, oh, those are like the prudish people who are trying to control your mind. Those people are in the Democratic Party now, to a large extent, which, and you and I, Holly, have talked about this before, that's a big part of the reason we feel alienated from the party we came up with, because I don't want to be with anybody who's a groupthink kind of mentality. That
Yeah.
just doesn't, I'm too stubborn, and I don't work
The
like.
world's too complicated for it. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the reality, you know. So Ryan, I think it's, you know, so here you are, you meet Nancy Jacobson, you get involved with No Label, start writing for the organization, and it's kind of a can't we all get along? Let's have bipartisan meetings. And then fast forward, and you are the leader in taking on a sitting American president, really. When did you realize that the playing field had changed and that the stakes were raised a little bit?
Well, look, you were there in some of those early days with No Labels, and it was just, even only 10 years ago, it was just a different time. We would kind of talk about civility and the need for it, and we would host all these forums, and we just, talk policy. So the early stuff No Labels did, we did the Make Congress Work was one of the first reform buckets we did. We would just host these like very nice conferences where you'd have think tank type people and politicians, and everybody's talking civilly. When that all started to change is when No Labels went from being, hey, we're going to just try to facilitate conversation between the sides, to more of, there's something so broken right now, we're actually going to challenge the established order. And of course, that was the unity ticket. And that was the moment that, whereas early on, I was having these policy discussions and, going to these civil academic forums, and before you know it, I'm like, doing depositions with lawyers and, dealing with these attack pieces that are coming out against us. Of course, I just learned there was a dossier created on me and my family that was going to be used if we went forward with our unity ticket. So yeah, it's when you question the established wisdom or established order, the establishment fights back pretty relentlessly. And of course, as I think a lot of people who listen to us know, it got so bad, we filed a complaint with the Department of Justice earlier this year, like a civil rights complaint.
I do hope that the full story of that whole saga is really brought to light at some point, because it did really, it was so disappointing to see friends and allies in the Democratic Party be so anti-democratic in their actions while they were charging the other side with doing the exact same thing.
Well, you and I have talked about this before, Holly, that like what happened was at some point in these last couple of years, there were some people who decided that stopping Trump from getting back into office was so important that the means always justified the ends, that any tactic was acceptable in service of that goal. So all of a sudden now, you have people advocating for, let's just not let them go on the voting ballots. Let's not let anybody compete in the Democratic primary against President Biden. Let's try to keep any independent groups or parties off the ballot. And I think it is important for people to realize how despicable that is. Right? Like, in other words, we're not naive. We've all been in politics for a long time. And people play hardball. That's okay. That comes with the territory. But the one thing you don't get to be is you don't get to be the white knight pro-democracy people publicly when behind the scenes you are doing everything you can to sue to keep people off the ballot, to prevent anybody from even coming on the playing field, to demonizing anybody that disagrees with you as like some kind of MAGA plant or something like that. And that's
demonized. I mean, remember, I forget his name because I never wanted to learn it, but on a fairly well listened to podcast, The Bulwark, what's his name, basically said all of our lives should be destroyed.
Yes.
And then when he was challenged and they said, well, did you really mean that? He said, yes.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it's outrageous.
they had, you know, there were the leaked recordings, and people can look this up. It's in Semaphore. It was, I think, from like December of last year. There were leaked recordings of a meeting, you know, where the groups were plotting against how to undermine no labels ballot access. And it really sounds like the wiretaps of John Gotti that you heard at the Ravenite Social Club in the 1980s, when he talked about how he was going to whack people because they stepped out of line. It was the exact same kind of mentality. And these people, they really have a lot to answer for, because they just got so high on their own supply.
Yeah, they
So
inserted
convinced.
their judgment for everybody else's. But
Yeah.
you know, I mean, and as outrageous and despicable as that whole thing was, too, the fact that the mainstream media seemed not to care. They
No.
really did not care.
No, I mean, look, I really give credit. There were absolutely some journalists and reporters and editors who gave us a fair hearing.
Yes.
But there were way too many just willing to accept at face value some of this stuff, and to not be more curious and more critical of some of the things these groups were doing. And look, I have a lot of respect for voters and for just Americans in general. And I'm not saying that in a pandering way. I really mean it in that lots of people in this country, they may not follow politics like really closely. They might not understand all the intricacies of given policies, but they have an intuition about when they're not getting it straight, when they're being condescended to, and it pisses them off. And that's something I actually really like about Americans, is we are not sheep. You know, like I always used to say, you know, you would hear there's a kind of Democrat, and you know who they are, Holly. It's like they would hold up Europe as the example. Like we should be like more like Europe. And I would always be like, why? I don't like Europeans are much more apt to fall in line, unfortunately. If you look at, like, they don't have a First Amendment in a lot of those countries. You know, but like, I don't know, have you seen what's happening in the UK right now, where there are people like who write some controversial thing on social media, and then they get a visit from the police, you know, because it's classified as like J.K. Rowling.
Right.
Is getting is apparently in the crosshairs of law enforcement over there because she's saying some unconventional things.
Well, it's yeah, I mean, as you were saying all that, I was thinking of our friend Matt Taibbi, who got a visit from the IRS on Christmas Eve.
He did?
You know,
yes. Yep. Just for he was of course the reporter behind the Twitter files, which showed this very troubling degree of collusion between you know, digital media companies and the government. And so look, on the back end of this election, I just think there's a big decision that people in the country have to make, and leaders have to make, which is like, where are we going to go from here? Do we just want to keep perpetuating this cycle that it just has gotten us to a very bad place? And we all know that when we look at the playing field in Washington in 2025, like, you have some Republicans who think their job is to just do whatever Donald Trump says. Like, there was some congressman from Texas. He literally said, you know, if Donald Trump says, you know, jump 3 foot high and pat our heads, then we jump 3 foot high and pat our heads. And I looked at it, I said, why are you even there? Like, if your only job is to do what the dear leader says, then a monkey can do your job, and we can just train him to press the yes button. But you know, on the other side, there's some people on the left who just want to like replay resistance, and people don't want that either.
People want results. I think you said it right after the election when we were together. You know, it's forces of resistance, a lot of forces of revenge, when the voters really just want results. But there's two things that I just want to call out in what you were saying, because I hadn't really thought of it like this before. But I do think one thing that unites many of us who are connected and certainly work for No Labels is a respect for the voters and an understanding that they are wise. They may not be technically sophisticated about every, bill or issue, but they absolutely are. I definitely feel that. My grandparents, first generation Irish, did not go to college, and but they understood, what was in their best interests, and who was in the larger country's best interest and who was not. And so I definitely share that kind of respect for the voters.
Yeah, well, I mean, and look, this, in the aftermath of this election, look, it is true that Donald Trump won the biggest victory Republicans won in 20 years. I mean, he won the popular vote and got the House and the Senate. That's all true. On the other hand, if 250,000 votes went the other way in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, Kamala Harris would be the next president. Which is to say, don't overread your mandate. One of our pollsters we work closely with, I thought, had a really interesting view on the coalition that Trump built. And what he said was, Donald Trump has got his base and they're with him, but these people that put him over the top, he rented them.
Absolutely.
He does not own them. And his point was, and these are the voters, young people, Black people, Hispanic people. These are the coalitions that hadn't previously been with him that moved his way. They are there because they expect results. And if he delivers those results, and by that I mean the border gets secure, prices come down, the things they care about get addressed, they will continue to give him a chance. If it's just a 2-year retribution and revenge fantasy that makes Marjorie Taylor Greene very happy, then they're going to leave him again. And that's exactly how it should be.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it was interesting that you did see more movement, people who had voted in the past Democratic moving over a little bit in the opposite direction. But I think that bode well for future independent thinking, because really at the end of the day, that's what we are trying to protect at No Labels, the ability for our elected officials to have independent thinking where they can every once in a while put the interests of the country over the party.
Well, I think that's important to say. Like, look, if you're a Democrat today, and when we talk about the resistance and kind of what a failure that is, it doesn't mean you roll over. It doesn't mean you're in the opposition. And a lot of what Trump is going to do, Democrats are going to oppose, as they should, because they don't agree with what he's trying to do. The problem is, and Holly, we talk about this all the time, the problem in Washington today is if you take 10 issues and we disagree on 8 of them, the instinct of people is to say, therefore, you're dead to me. Why are we even talking? Because we don't agree on these 8 things. We're just trying to get the people together who believe, but wait a minute, there's 2 things we actually might agree on. Why don't we actually just try to get there? See if we can't do something. And look, we'll have another election in 2 years and we'll fight and we'll call each other names and attack each other. Fine. That's what politics is. But there does. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to say the interesting thing, because we've seen this with the infrastructure bill and then with all the subsequent bipartisan legislative successes that followed that in our kind of bicameral process. The interesting thing is they were actually excited to be able to work together and find common ground, and proud to identify where the line was too far. But they, for many of them, I think it's been members of the House and Senate, it's been terribly frustrating to be in a body that so rewards and encourages dysfunction and punishes problem solving, and to be in a process that we help create and supported by the No Labels community of folks in every state all over the country who are just rewarding, supporting, and cheering on elected officials for doing that. I thought that was really an inspiring and rewarding thing to be a part of.
Well, and it's not, a lot of this is not rocket science. I mean, one of No Label's allies, somebody we really think is a great up-and-coming leader, is Marie Gluskamp-Perez
Mhm.
out of Washington. And look, she's a Democrat, she's unapologetic about it. And yet, if you look at some of the things she's been talking about, this is what's really been missing in our politics, is just the common sense aspect of it. And this is one of the things she fought against. And I want to just share this because it's so illustrative of the problem with our government and the way in which we can fix it. So she actually ran an auto body shop before she got to Congress. And one of the regulatory agencies in Washington was going to pass a law that required table saw makers to have this automated mechanism that would shut off the saw if it touched like a human finger or hand or something. And they said, well, this is a safety measure. And what Marie said was, wait a minute, here's what you don't understand. This is going to increase the cost of these table saws by $400. So guess what's going to happen? People are going to buy hand saws and they're going to use those instead, and they're going to cut off more fingers. And it's like people in Washington just don't think like that. There was another regulation that like preschool teachers could not serve fresh fruit unless there were these elaborate cleaning stations. Like they couldn't cut up fresh fruit for the kids. So the consequence of that is they just have to serve kids like junk food out of a bag. And I think that it's those kinds of things that drive people insane, that lose you elections.
Mhm.
And what she understands, and what I think the people in our coalition understands, is they are there to deliver for those things, to
Mhm.
deliver common sense solutions to actual problems in actual people's lives. And if you get caught up in the, as James Carville likes to say, the faculty room lounge crap,
Mm.
you're going to lose a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ryan, one thing that I get asked all the time, and I'd be interested to know from you, where do you turn for your news and kind of truth? What sources of news and information do you rely on to give it to you straight?
So I'm a big fan of the Free Press, which is Barry Weiss's
Yep.
relatively new startup outlet. Read a lot of Substack newsletters. I still read the Wall Street. I read the Wall Street Journal a lot. I think their news section in particular, I think, is really good. I do still subscribe to and read the New York Times and the Washington Post, though if I'm being honest, it's getting harder to read it sometimes. I'm hoping they maybe have a little bit of a corrective coming out of the back end. But it is interesting. I really have, for lack of a better word, turn to a lot more alternative media.
Yeah.
A lot of podcasts, a lot of Substack. Just because I actually feel like I'm getting more straight, honest news. And look, a lot of the people who are on Substack, for example, I'm thinking about like a Andrew Sullivan or a Matt Taibbi or
Martin Gurry.
You name it. Like these are really capable people who are doing serious journalism, but at various points they just found it was way too suffocating to operate in some of the legacy media outlets. Like Andrew Sullivan was at New York Magazine and Matt Taibbi was at Rolling Stone, and they realized that at a certain point, the pushing a narrative became more important than getting the real story. And look, the readership numbers and the viewership numbers of these outlets, we've all been reading this week about the reach of the podcasters.
Well, we predicted that, if you recall, well before it came into being, largely because, I really tuned into the anti-California, which was code for a lot of stuff, conversation in the Joe Rogan universe. And I think one interesting thing that the Democratic Party needs to understand, it wasn't about if the vice president did Joe Rogan's interview or not. That was an ongoing conversation for well over a year that reached millions and millions of people that traditional media and traditional politics completely ignored. you know?
Look, part of it is just the format, to be able to talk in a forum with somebody for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours.
We're gonna go 2 hours, is that what you're telling me?
Yeah. Well, Mary Ann is working us up towards that because
Exactly.
the taskmaster, and eventually that she wants to squeeze everything she can. In fact, I'm like looking at my timer because we'll have to tape on Thanksgiving morning.
I'm sure, exactly.
Reach our allotted limit here.
But it makes sense that you would seek out those new sources because I'm going to add to your long list of titles and accomplishments now, the father of new media, right? You were the head of the new media division at the DS. There you go.
I was part of the new media team, yes, back when it was called that. Yeah. Well, look, Holly, I think we have a hopefully increased mutual understanding of how we both got here.
Yeah.
What we're doing here, besides Mary Ann forcing us to be here. That's why we're here always. But
Always.
we actually are starting to enjoy this now, and it's good.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure and a privilege really to get to work with you, Ryan. And I appreciate so much how no matter what's happening, no matter how crazy the news or information or forces opposing us or demanding our attention are, you always seem to be able to, in a very thoughtful way, navigate kind of a sensible course. So when I do call you our rabbi and all this other stuff, but I mean it, and it's reassuring to know that there's a judgment at this core of the politics of problem solving that is consistent. So I appreciate that about you.
That's because I go home and scream into my pillow for so I get it out. Well, look, Holly, thank you very much for taking a couple of minutes here on this special holiday week podcast. I hope everybody has a great trip to wherever they're going with their families. I hope, Mary Ann, we have satisfied you here, the length and content of our. By the way, Mary Ann is now looking at us. Here's the funny thing. Even the way we tape this podcast, there's Mary Ann is in this almost like, when you when you go to like a pharmacist and they're looking up, they're looking down at you from above. So even the way we tape this has her staring down at us, but she seems happy. So I think
Mary Ann, do you want to say anything to defend yourself?
My Mary Ann PSA, just really quick. This is the first podcast that I've had to Google while y'all are speaking. Can you curse in a podcast? With Brian Clancy in the first 5 minutes. It does say it's allowed. We just may have to bleep it depending on our audience. So we'll decide.
I don't think I used any of George Carlin's 7 words. It was a PG-13 swear, I think. So I'm okay.
Okay, we'll go with that.
We'll go with that. Now you're in trouble, Ryan. Mary Ann, we're grateful for you. We're grateful for you.
At the end of this. Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, you really drove No Labels to be on Substack, drove us to have a podcast. So great work, and we appreciate you.
If I'm not on the next podcast, I've been disappeared by Mary.
Exactly. Deep six.
Yes. Everybody have a great holiday. You too, Holly.
Okay, take care.